Chess fans around the world were once shaken by an astonishing phenomenon when a 12-year-old Vietnamese boy unexpectedly defeated the world's #1 blitz player, Hikaru Nakamura. At the time, Nakamura was ranked 3rd in the world in classical chess, with an ELO rating as high as 2,788, and after the game, he could not help but exclaim that it would not be any exaggeration at all to say that Quang Dai would one day become a grandmother. However, few people know that even though Quang Dai was only 12 years old, he had already brilliantly overcome many senior masters to win the national championship trophy in classical chess at Vietnam's top-level chess tournament in 2023. Today, we will take a closer look at the game between the 12-year-old chess prodigy Quang Dai, with an online blitz ELO of 2,914, and the world's #1 blitz player Hikaru Nakamura, whose online blitz ELO stands at 3,265. Before we begin, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please hit the subscribe button and click the bell to receive notifications for the latest chess games. And don't forget to leave a like to support the channel. Alright, let's get started. Facing the battle god Nakamura, Quang Dai boldly opens the game by pushing the pawn to e4. Nakamura immediately responds with the unusual pawn move to a6, a tricky sideline clearly intended to unsettle and bully the 12-year-old prodigy. White calmly continues by pushing the pawn to d4, firmly claiming the center. Black replies with the pawn to e6, still not revealing which opening setup he intends to use. White develops the knight to f3, bringing a piece into play and reinforcing central control. After a few cautious opening moves, Nakamura suddenly pushes the pawn to d5, launching a counterattack in the center. White advances the pawn to e5, locking the center and steering the game into a French defense structure. Black pushes the pawn to c5, continuing to challenge the center. White responds with the pawn to c3, solidly reinforcing the central structure. In the French defense, Black's bishop on c8 often struggles to find activity, so Black develops the bishop to d7 early, seeking a way out. White develops the bishop to d3. Black quickly jumps the bishop to b5, offering a trade and targeting White's powerful bishop. Not wanting to give up this strong attacking piece, White retreats the bishop to c2, avoiding the exchange, with the idea of later pushing the pawn to a4 to chase the bishop away before castling. Seeing this plan, Black immediately pushes the pawn to a5, creating a retreat square for the bishop on a6. White plays a4, attacking the bishop, and Black, well prepared, calmly retreats the bishop to a6, continuing to control the long diagonal from f1 to a6 and preventing White from castling. White then develops the knight to a3, a rare move since knights are seldom developed to the edge, but in this position, with the pawn occupying c3 and blocking the usual square, it makes complete sense. Black captures the pawn on d4, White recaptures on d4. Black jumps the bishop to b4 with check. White remains completely calm and blocks the check by developing the bishop to d2. Black develops the queenside knight to c6, and White jumps the knight to b5, successfully blocking the dangerous f1 to a6 diagonal. Black captures the bishop on d2, and White recaptures with the queen. Black then captures the knight on b5. White uses the pawn to recapture on b5, threatening to attack the knight. Black retreats the knight to b4. After a series of rapid exchanges, the position opens up significantly. White, with more space on the king side, now has good prospects for launching an attack there, while Black plans to use the open c-file to counterattack on the queen side. White castles and Black moves the knight to f7, preparing to castle as well. In our view, White should now retreat the bishop to b1, preserving this dangerous attacking piece and waiting for Black to castle before launching a full-scale assault on the Black king. However, White becomes impatient and pushes the rook to a3, intending to use the third rank to swing the rook across to the king side for an attack. Seizing the opportunity, Black immediately exchanges the knight on c2, eliminating the dangerous bishop. White recaptures with the queen on c2. Black then castles, bringing the king into safety and preparing for major battles ahead. White brings the rook to a1, placing it on the open a file and putting pressure on the pawn on a5. Black responds by moving the rook to c8, attacking the queen and at the same time avoiding lining up on the same file against White's doubled rooks. Determined not to give up control of the open c file, White slides the rook over to c3, stepping in front of the queen. Not wanting to complicate matters, Black immediately exchanges rooks on c3, and White recaptures with the queen on c3. Black then pushes the pawn to b6 to defend the pawn on a5. White boldly advances the pawn to b4, breaking through on the queenside. Black captures the pawn on b4, and White recaptures with the queen on b4. Black moves the queen to c7, firmly occupying the open c file. With no need to rush, White calmly pushes the pawn to h3, creating an escape square for the king in case of trouble. Black mirrors the idea by pushing the pawn to h6, quietly waiting for the next development. White jumps the queen to d6, offering a queen trade. Here Black could retreat the queen to c3 to counterattack the rook on a1, but believing that retreating would concede the initiative, Black chooses to exchange queens on d6. White recaptures with the pawn on d6, chasing the knight. Black moves the knight to f5, attacking the pawn on d6. White pushes the pawn forward to d7. Black brings the rook to d8, continuing to surround this dangerous passed pawn. White slides the rook down to a7 to defend it. Black pushes the pawn to f6, defending the square on c5 and opening a path for the king to step forward and help capture the pawn on d7. White moves the rook to b7, capturing the pawn on b6. Unable to save that pawn, Black follows the plan and marches the king up to f7. White pushes the pawn to g4, chasing the knight. Black retreats the knight to d6, attacking the rook. White captures the pawn on b6 with the rook, threatening the knight. Black captures the pawn on d7 with the rook, protecting the knight. With all paths blocked and no immediate breakthrough, White retreats the knight to e1, planning to maneuver it to d3, and then to c5 to support the queenside passed pawn. Black moves the king to e7. White follows the plan and jumps the knight to d3. Believing his king has reached the center faster, Black brings the rook to b7, offering a rook trade. If White refuses, the pawn on b5 will fall, so White is forced to exchange rooks on b7. The Black knight recaptures on b7. White moves the king to e1, bringing it toward the center. Black advances the king to d6. Concerned that Black might push the pawn to e5 and seize the center, White pushes the pawn to f4, forming a pawn clamp with d4 and f4. Black responds by pushing the pawn to g5, breaking the structure. White rushes the king to e2, urgently centralizing it. Black jumps the knight to f5, lying in wait. If White were to move the king to e3, Black could jump the knight to c4 with check, easily stopping White's passed pawn. But the Vietnamese prodigy reacts sharply, pushing the pawn to b6, using it as bait to force the knight into a defensive role. Unfooled, Black captures the pawn on f4, White recaptures with the knight on f4, and Black pushes the pawn to e5, attacking the knight. White retreats the knight to h5, threatening the pawn on f6. In our view, Black could now retreat the knight to c6, putting pressure on the pawn on d4. If White captures on f6, Black could then capture on d4 and establish a very strong central pawn duo. However, Black grows impatient and captures the pawn on d4 instead, destroying his own central pawn advantage. Without hesitation, White captures the pawn on f6. With a pawn majority on the king side and the pawn on b6 earlier, White now has two powerful attacking fronts, making it very difficult for Black to defend both sides. Realizing the danger, Black moves the king to c5 to hunt pawns. White advances the king to d3. Black captures the pawn on b6, then quickly brings the king to c6, trying to rush back toward the king side to protect the pawns there. But distant defense cannot save a nearby fire. White uses the knight to capture the pawn on d5, gaining a clear advantage with an extra pawn. Black moves the king to d6, trying to stay close and defend the pawn on h6. White retreats the knight to e3, threatening to jump to f5 with check and win more pawns. Sensing danger, Black hurriedly moves the king to e6, but still cannot stop the knight from jumping to f5 and attacking the pawn. Acting on instinct, Black pushes the pawn to h5, trying to break through. White responds with the knight jumping to g7 with check. This tricky move by Kwang Dai forces Nakamura to move the king to f6. White calmly captures the pawn on h5. Down to pawns, Black has nothing left to lose and drives the king to g5, trying to get close and recover material. White brings the king to e4 to support the pawns. In our view, Black should have rushed the king to h4 to pressure White, but instead, in the actual game, Black jumps the knight to c4, trying to move quickly toward the king's side to assist. White calmly retreats the king to f3, solidifying the position before slowly advancing. Black jumps the knight to d2 with check. White moves the king to g2, Black pushes the king to h4. White pulls the knight back to g3, threatening to jump to f5 with check. Seeing the danger, Black retreats the king to g5. White moves the knight back to f1, aiming to exchange knights. Black responds by moving the knight to c4. Only then does White quietly advance the king to g3, standing shoulder to shoulder with the two pawns. Black retreats the knight to d6. White pushes the pawn to h4 with check. Black moves the king to g6. White advances the king to f4. Black retreats the knight to e8. White jumps the knight to g3, and Black responds by moving the knight to f6. After a long journey from the edge of the board, Black has finally brought the knight back near the king to help block White's pawns. White pushes the pawn to h5 with check. Black moves the king to h7. Pressing the advantage, White pushes the pawn to g5, chasing the knight, which retreats to d5 in an attempt to cause trouble. White storms forward with the king to e5, attacking the knight. Black retreats the knight to e3. White moves the king to f6, tightening the noose. With nothing left to lose, Black jumps the knight to g4 with check, and White moves the king to e6. Black then retreats the knight to f2, and White advances the king to f7. After a series of precise maneuvers, dodging checks and closing in on the promotion square, Black's position now looks like a fish on the chopping board. Black jumps the knight to g4. White pushes the pawn to g6 with check, launching the final assault. In danger, Black moves the king to h6. White immediately pushes the pawn to g7, preparing promotion. Black jumps the knight to e5 with check. White retreats the king to f6. Black gives another check by jumping the knight back to g4. White moves the king to f7. Black again jumps the knight to e5 with check. This time, instead of repeating moves and allowing a draw, White changes course and retreats the king to e6, chasing the knight away. Black is forced to give up the knight to capture the pawn on g7. White captures the knight on e5. Black moves the king to h6. With no need to rush, White coldly retreats the king to f4, cutting off the Black king's path. At this point, realizing there is no longer any way to resist, the Thunder God Hikaru Nakamura is forced to raise the white flag and resign. If Black attempts to resist, the game will proceed as follows.